Hello and welcome to Private Ocean's virtual event, The Road Ahead, a presentation that will address the impact of the coronavirus on the upcoming November election and the economy. I'm Greg Friedman, the founder and CEO of Private Ocean Wealth Management. Today's conversation is the type of timely and important information that we typically bring to our clients, but due to the extraordinary circumstances, we were able to bring this to a much larger audience. Joining me today is Greg Valliere, and Greg is a nationally known political and economic strategist and has followed Washington for investors for 40 years. He doesn't look that old, by the way. He has held several positions in his career, including Director of Research at the Charles Schwab Washington Research Group. He's currently the Chief U.S. Policy Strategist at AGF Investments, a Toronto-based financial firm. And he's a frequent guest on CNBC, CNN, Fox TV, Bloomberg TV, and radio. And he's regularly quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, among many others. Many of you will recognize Greg. Before we get started, just a couple of ground rules. Attendees are muted during the session. At the end of Greg's presentation, we're going to use any remaining time to address some of the questions that were submitted during registration. You all. So if you'd like to listen or share it with others, that will certainly be available. And finally, when Greg gets going, I'm going to turn off my camera while Greg is speaking, but I will return at the end and follow up with some questions. So Greg, first, I just want to thank you for joining me today and for taking the time to share your insight on a subject that I know is top of mind for many of us. So with that, welcome, Greg, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank all of you for joining us. I would say at the outset, I hope all of you and your families are in good health during this terrible time. I have greatly enjoyed working with Greg and his colleagues. It's a wonderful group, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. I'm going to talk about 5 big themes, and then we'll have some time, I think, for questions. First, I want to talk about whether the U.S. can avoid a depression. I think we can, and I'll tell you why. Secondly, I've got to talk about an issue that I think will become increasingly controversial, and that is the growing antipathy toward China on the part of the US, Western Europe, Australia, Canada. Third, I want to talk about people. Do we have the discipline to self-distance, to stay away from crowds? How will life change in the next year or so? Fourth, I want to talk briefly about vaccines, which is the one thing we all have to focus on. And then finally, my favorite subject, I want to talk about the upcoming election and what this terrible virus means for the November 3rd voting, which is just around the corner. So let me start first with the economy. I think we can avoid a Great Depression, but you can't sugarcoat the second quarter. It's going to be horrible, a deeply negative GDP. The unemployment will go even higher. It's at 14.7, I think, now. After last Friday's number, I think unemployment could go to 20% in the next month or two before it begins to come back down. But I do think as we get deep into the third quarter and then into the fourth quarter, the economy will start to look a little bit better. I think it's naive to hope for a V. I think a V is unlikely, but I do see some growth, and many Fed officials see some growth as we get toward the end of the year. And the main reason I say that is the extraordinary amount of stimulus, unlike anything we have ever seen in our lifetime. In the Great Depression in the 30s, we did everything wrong. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates. The government decreased spending. That's not what you should do. And I think we've learned lessons. And to take both of the sources of stimulus, first I talk a little bit about monetary stimulus. We heard today from a very concerned Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, who I think has done a wonderful job. I would give him an A or an A+. Even Donald Trump, who has been very critical of Powell, called him up earlier this spring and said the Fed is doing a great job. And I think Powell has made it clear that the Fed is prepared to do virtually anything to keep markets liquid, to provide the lubrication for the markets. I think that Powell knows there's maybe a crisis looming with state and local governments. I think he's prepared to do something there. I think virtually everything is on the table at the Fed except for 2 options. Number one, I think the Fed really, really does not want negative rates. And he made that clear today in his testimony. You can't rule it out, There are many in the markets who are thinking negative rates are possible at some point in 2021, but I think the Federal Reserve will really focus on other options than that. Secondly, I think the Fed would be extremely reluctant to buy stock. I get the question all the time. If the market goes down again, would the Fed consider buying equities? I think the answer is no, because it would be an enormous conflict of interest. To have the government own stock in companies that the government regulates, I think would not be a good idea. And I think the Fed would stay away from that. But otherwise, I think virtually all options will stay on the table for Jerome Powell. The other source of stimulus, of course, is fiscal stimulus. And we've seen an extraordinary amount of spending. Even before the crisis, of course, the deficit was going to be a little over $1 trillion. Washington has become re-addicted to spending. We certainly were last year. But I think now, after what we've gotten and what we will get this summer, the deficit in this fiscal year could exceed $4 trillion. And in the new year that starts on October 1, we could be getting close to $3 trillion. These are unprecedented numbers. It's starting to make a few deficit hawks, mostly Republicans, worried about the implications down the road. But I would say that most of Washington feels that right now this is about triage. The main goal is to save the patient. At some point in 2024, we'll have to worry about debt servicing, but I don't think that's an option right now that we can afford to look at. Could this lead to inflation? No time soon. We got inflation data this morning. The PPI showed we have to worry about deflation, I think, over the next year or two before we would worry about an inflationary threat coming from very, very high budget deficits. So as far as fiscal stimulus goes, we've already gotten about $3 trillion. And yesterday, Nancy Pelosi proposed another $3 trillion. I think that her proposal was, shall we say, aspirational. I think she knows she's not going to get another $3 trillion. And I think she wanted to have a campaign document. Everything but the kitchen sink was put into her bill, including aid to marijuana producers, aid to the post office, all sorts of stuff was thrown into her bill. And the Republicans predictably howled that it was way too expensive. But I do think we'll get one more bill. It's going to take a while. Both parties are at odds on several provisions, which I'll get into in a second. But I think the key player here is Donald Trump. Trump is never really worried about deficits, and I think he would favor still another bill. It may be July before we get it, but I think Trump knows that if we spend more money, the economy could look better and his reelection prospects could look better. So I think Trump will be the driving force, telling many reluctant Republicans who worry about the deficit, don't worry about the deficit. I want more spending. I think Trump will prevail on this and the Democrats will go along. The problem, of course, is the details. Trump wants a payroll tax cut, which I don't see. There's not a lot of enthusiasm for that in either party. Trump had talked about infrastructure. I don't see that being in the bill. It would be another $1 trillion. I think infrastructure is coming, maybe late this year or more likely in 2021, but it may not be in this bill. Now you have Mitch McConnell saying, I want liability protection. We don't want to have companies that have legal issues lying exposed to lawsuits. And I think what McConnell is saying is that if you got coronavirus and you think it was because of your job or because of where you were, there's not going to be a blanket authority to sue. Needless to say, this has greatly angered the trial attorneys who have a lot of influence among the Democrats. So this is going to be another issue that will prevail for quite some time. Still another issue would be with the state and local government assistance, and I think we'll get at least 500 trillion, maybe more. I think we'll get 500 billion. Sorry, billions and trillions can be mixed up now. I think we'll probably get 500 billion in state and local government aid, maybe even a little bit more. But I think there will be a sharp disagreement between the parties. The Republicans do not want to allocate anything to states that have poorly managed pension funds. I think that it's going to be hard to get any money for that, but there's a real risk to state and local governments. The states have been spending more because they need to pay firemen and police, and you have to pay medical personnel, and more significantly, revenues to the states have just fallen off a cliff. And I think the states are in dire shape. I think the Fed may have to help, but I think there'll be aid to the states in this bill. There'll be more aid for testing, for hospitals. It'll be a pretty big package. And then I think we'll sit back in late summer and see if that's enough. My guess is that may be enough. There may be a little addition here and there, for example, for small businesses. There could be one more tranche of money, but I think they've got to make really tough distinctions on who deserves it, who earns this money, and who doesn't deserve it. I think the program has had a lot of problems with restaurant chains and private schools maybe not deserving this. So that's going to have to be tinkered with as well. So my first point, and this is the longest one of this presentation, but my first point is I see plenty of stimulus coming. And I think in Washington, the view is the sky's the limit. Money is no object. We're going to spend a lot of money, and I anticipate questions from all of you about how we're going to unwind this later in the decade. And no one has a good answer. But again, I think the prevalent mood right now is triage, that we have to save the patient. Second big issue, and one that I think is going to linger for a while, is the growing antipathy toward China. A feeling in both parties. This is not a Donald Trump crusade necessarily, although he's been quite outspoken, but I think Democrats as well. Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer, people around the world have looked at China and said that they have not been forthcoming. They have not shown transparency. The Chinese have not let us know uh, where this started. There's a lot they need to tell the world. And now to compound things, just in the last few days, the Chinese have told the U.S. they would like to reopen the U.S.-China trade deal, the so-called Phase One. Trump has dismissed that idea out of hand. China, according to the New York Times a couple of days ago, has been aggressively hacking into U.S. firms that are working on a vaccine. And China, as you all know, in the last couple of weeks has cracked down on dissidents in Hong Kong, maybe thinking that the rest of the world would be not paying attention. So you look at all of these things, and the Chinese government, I'm hardly talking about the Chinese people, but the Chinese government, I think, has been a villain in all of this. And I think there's a growing feeling in Washington that there will be some retribution from the government here. So what might happen? Well, some people have talked about suing Beijing. That's ridiculous. I mean, you're not going to get a dollar in a lawsuit against Beijing claiming that they are responsible for the virus. Other people have said, well, maybe we should deny them interest payments on treasury bonds that they hold. Well, that would send a chilling message to the fixed income market, and I don't think that's very likely. But there are two other options that I think Washington might consider to punish China. One would be tariffs. I mean, Donald Trump, as we all know, says repeatedly, I'm a tariff guy. And it's possible that Trump may impose new tariffs on China. I think the more likely option, the fourth option, would be to address the dependence of the U.S. on Chinese supply lines. China supplies a lot of medical equipment. They supply a lot of pharmaceuticals. And I think there's a feeling in Congress that maybe there should be legislation to curb our reliance on China, or more likely, to have incentives for firms that bring these jobs back to the US, or maybe bring them to Bangladesh or Vietnam or wherever. But I think there's going to be a serious look by Congress at the supply chains that we've become so dependent on with the Chinese. So I have to conclude that we're in a deep freeze. I think US-China relations will be sour for quite some time. Maybe next year things will look a little more optimistic, but I think for China's manufacturing sector, this is going to be a serious issue. Third subject, and it's been a very controversial subject over the last 2 or 3 days. That's this growing gap between one part of America that wants everything opened up quickly and has had very uh, uh, raucous protests against governors who have not moved fast enough, and then the other part of America that got reinforcement yesterday from Dr. Fauci that says no, we can't move too fast. This would be a mistake. Fauci, I thought, was quite blunt yesterday in saying that if we open up too quickly, we could have a lot more deaths. And we have seen new hotspots, including, ironically, in Georgia, where the governor was very controversial in opening up the state first of any state in the country. And now he's got hotspots and he's starting to close things back down again. But you do have a very, very angry group of people, maybe 25%. The media loves films of protest, so it's made all the media to see people protesting. But I think it's worth noting that in every poll that I've seen, something like 60 or 65% of the public has said, no, go slow. We don't want to go fast. I think the majority of Americans is happy to see the things starting to open up, but they're very anxious about seeing things opening up too quickly. I think that in order for this to work, you have to accept a premise that there will be new behaviors by all of us. There'll be social distancing. I'm not. When I finally get to spend some time with Greg, I'm not going to shake hands with him. I'm going to bump elbows with Greg and all my friends. We all bump elbows. We're going to keep 6 feet away from others. I live in a building where you have to wear a mask all the time, and I've gotten used to it. It's not a great sacrifice. We're going to have more testing, more tracking. There might be things that'll infringe upon personal liberties, but I do think that behavior from all of us is really crucial. And I think Fauci has great credibility when he talks about that. I think that hopefully he will prevail and we will move slowly and not have to see a new round of infections. A fourth subject, just very briefly, I'd say one thing I look for almost every day is whether there's any news about a vaccine. That's the game changer, obviously. A lot of companies are making real strides. You've got Gilead in Silicon Valley. You've got a firm in Oxford at the university in the UK. You've got work by Pfizer. A lot of companies are getting closer, but I think what people overlook is that you've got to have clinical trials. And even an optimist like me would have to concede that we're probably not going to have anything readily available until sometime in the winter. Earlier, people were hoping maybe by fall we'd have something. I think that is aspirational, to use that word again. And Fauci, I think, has made it clear that it's going to take a while before we get one. And it may not be just one vaccine, it might be a cocktail like the AIDS vaccine. So that's the game changer. But I think for anyone to think we're going to have readily available vaccines by October is sadly, that's not going to happen. We still have a ways to go before we get that. Finally, my favorite subject, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. My favorite subject, of course, is politics, and it's going to be a fascinating election, to say the least. I would start by saying that after Trump was acquitted in the impeachment trial late January, it sure looked to many in the markets and the people in Vegas and people, bookmakers in London, it sure looked like Trump was the favorite to win re-election. I think that has changed. I think Trump has gone from being a fairly clear favorite in January, early February, to being at best tied right now. Things have changed a lot. I look at a lot of polls, and the polls have shown a majority of Americans feel he hasn't done a good job. He's been inconsistent. He boasts constantly about what a great job he's doing. And believe me, the Democrats have all the tape of Trump saying, well, we only have 15 cases going to zero, or Trump saying, well, by April when it's warm, the disease will go away. And of course, most memorably, Trump saying that maybe drinking or injecting disinfectants like Clorox might help in curing the disease. Well, all of those are on tape. And all of those will be shown repeatedly during the fall by Democrats who feel that Trump was way too dismissive of the threat in February, March, into April, before he realized what a real crisis we had. Now, that said, I think Trump has something going for him. I'll be an equal opportunity cynic on both sides of the aisle. I think Trump has something going for him, and that's Joe Biden. I think Biden is not a very dynamic candidate. Uh, Biden has been holed up in his basement outside of Wilmington, Delaware, and has been not real visible. When he has come out, people want to ask him about a sexual assault charge from 27 years ago. I have no idea if it's true or not, but he keeps getting questions on that, which seemingly blocks his ability to talk about other issues. Moreover, I am quite certain that the Trump campaign will make a big issue of what they consider to be Joe Biden's lack of energy. I've known Biden for 40 years. He's not quite the same Joe Biden I used to know. He's not as quick. He looks like he's lost a step, and sometimes he can't find the right word. It happens to all of us. Hopefully, not me today, but sometimes you can't find the right word. And Biden, I think, could have some difficulty in a debate with Trump, who's such an aggressive debater, such a relentless debater. So there are other flaws that Biden has to worry about as well. I think Trump will hammer away at Biden's business dealings with China, Biden and his son Hunter. Of course, Trump has had business dealings, and it's to be fair, while the sexual assault charge may not go away, Trump has set the bar pretty low in that area. I think you'd have to say. So Trump, though, I think is the more vigorous, more aggressive candidate. That may help him. I think it's way too early to make a call on the election. I'm sorry, Greg would probably like a definitive answer from me, but I would say this. There are 4 states to watch really carefully. Those states are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona. 4 states that Hillary Clinton narrowly lost. If Biden could win 3 of those 4 states, and I think he's got a decent chance in Michigan, decent chance in Pennsylvania, if he could win 3 of those 4 states, he has a plausible path toward the presidency, toward the White House. It's not out of the question at all if he can capture those states. And you have to say there are a lot of groups, demographic groups in America that don't like Trump. College-educated women, people of color, people who live in the suburbs, young people, people who care a lot about the environment. We were going to talk more about the environment today, but that got preempted by the virus. But there are large groups of people in the country that will come out on a rainy day to vote against him. I'd be the first to agree that Trump has a very, very loyal base. As Trump famously said, I could walk up Fifth Avenue shooting people, and my base would not abandon me. And there's some truth to that. But there are big chunks of voters who I think have great antipathy toward him, and I think they'll turn out in pretty big numbers. I think one of the keys is whether Trump can get the Bernie Sanders voters, whether Biden can get the Bernie Sanders voters behind him. I think the jury's still out on that. A lot of Bernie voters have never been crazy about Biden. And I think, though, that you'll see the party come together more than they did for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. The choice of a running mate will be important. For Biden, I think there's only 3 likely options. The first, and the one that I've been hearing about all week, leaks coming out of the Biden camp, is Kamala Harris. I think that even though she beat him up pretty good in the first debate, Biden's people, I'm told, feel that in a lot of key states, she could add a point or a point and a half to the African American vote. So in a state like North Carolina or Virginia or Michigan, an African American on the ticket could make a difference, although Biden has pretty good support among African Americans. Second candidate, and one I don't know if I can quite understand this, but Elizabeth Warren is still on the list, but I'd say there are 2 problems with her. Well, first of all, she's a relentless campaigner. I think there's no question that she's a good campaigner, but I think for a lot of moderates, she's a little too polarizing. I think they would feel she's a little too far to the left. She would bring in Bernie voters. I would agree on that. But maybe most importantly, she's 70. She doesn't look 70, but she's 70. She'd be 71 next year during the campaign. Biden would be 78 in the inauguration. I think Biden needs somebody younger. And that then brings me to my third candidate, and my personal pick would be Amy Klobuchar, who's in her mid-50s, ran a pretty good campaign, made a lot of friends. People liked the way she campaigned. She would, I think, help Biden in the upper Midwest. She's from Minnesota. I think Biden is expected to win Minnesota, but she has support in Iowa and in Wisconsin, two states that border Minnesota. And those are states that are crucial. Hillary Clinton lost them by a narrow margin. So I think Amy Klobuchar being on the ticket could make a difference. So that's my handicapping. I think that for now, the candidate with the inside track may be Harris, but we've got a long way to go. That'll probably be announced in late August. I was going to say at the convention, but it's increasingly looking like there will not be a convention in Milwaukee. I think it'll be virtual. It'll be like this. Trump has been reluctant to say he would join in on a virtual convention. He, I think, would be bitterly disappointed if they don't have a big coronation in Charlotte, North Carolina. But I think the conventions are looking increasingly likely. Well, a lot more I could talk about. I think maybe it would be a good idea to stop and get some of your questions. I would just say, as I conclude, that what worries me the most is that we could get seduced into a sense of self-congratulation, triumphalism. In other words, when George W. Bush had mission accomplished, it wasn't accomplished. It wasn't done. And I do worry that people may feel that we've turned the corner and that things are going to just go straight up. This is going to be a rocky one. It's going to last for several quarters. I think, to make a baseball analogy, I think we're only in the third or fourth inning. I think we've got a long way to go. And I think people have to take a sober look. I do feel we can avoid a Great Depression. I think that's the good news. The bad news is, for anybody who thinks the virus has been defeated, it has not been defeated by a long shot. So I'm going to stop there, Greg. Love to take questions.
On that happy note.
Yeah, really.
Well, thanks, Greg. So we got a lot of questions that came in when people registered, and then we got a lot of
Sure.
questions coming in now, and we don't have you booked for 36 hours. So if we did, we'd have some fun. So I'm just going to hit some of the highlights because I can kind of group them. Let's see. So a lot of concern, and you addressed it, you touched on it a little bit. I just wonder if you have any more expansion about the government debt, right? So there's just a lot of
Yeah.
concern about what does the world look like when every country is taking on these levels of debt, and then we're
Yep.
taking on this level of debt. And, okay, we'll worry about it in 4 and 5 years. A lot of, like, we have kids, I have kids. What does that mean? Or what are the implications of that in your mind?
Well, we're all in the same boat. I mean, virtually every country you can think of is in the same boat. You look at horrible outbreaks now in Brazil, horrible outbreaks in Russia right now. So virtually everyone you can point to. Some countries have had a little bit better luck, New Zealand, for example, but in most of Western Europe, most major countries have had a terrible experience. So I would first of all say I cannot envision a run on the dollar because other countries are in even worse shape than we are. In fact, I could make a case that our economy will bounce back more quickly than other countries. I think Western Europe has a long, long slog ahead before they get back on their feet. I think we'll get back on our feet quicker. In Western Europe, there's always been an aversion to mammoth stimulus. I think part of it is the German trauma of the 1930s, where you need a basket full of Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. And I think that fear is irrational, but they went through it. I didn't. And I think that in much of Western Europe, there's an aversion to, for example, helping Italy, which has suffered terribly in this crisis. So I think by default, maybe the U.S. will look like it's in better shape than a lot of other countries around the world. So I think that's an important point that I would make. Will we reduce this debt? I've come to the view over the last few years that the bond markets really don't care that much about the deficit. Not that I embrace the theory it's called modern monetary theory, which holds that deficits are irrelevant. I wouldn't go quite that far, but I would say that the evidence is quite clear that the bond market hasn't cared. The interest rates have stayed reasonable. Inflation has stayed reasonable. So this is not a problem that would keep me awake at night. And to reiterate what I said earlier, Greg, I think the bigger concern is deflation. That's going to be a problem. I shudder to think the U.S. could go to negative rates. I think the Fed will be able to avoid it. To go to your questioner's bottom line, how do we unwind this? What do we do later in the decade? Well, we're going to have to hope for good growth. But beyond that, I think we're going to have to be disciplined in spending. I think that we're going to have to look at a tax hike on two sectors. I think the very wealthy are going to get hit, not right away, but maybe in 2, 3, 4 years, there is going to be a tax hike. And I also would say that in 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to have to look at some spending cuts, maybe even some sacrosanct areas like defense. Defense, we're spending like 700 billion a year on defense. We may have to slice that down a little bit. We may have to cut some other areas of spending, but that comes later. And I think that I'm not smart enough to go out 4 or 5 years, but I do think for the next 2 or 3 years, Greg, the greater threat would be deflation. And I think in those next 2 or 3 years, the U.S. will look relatively better than just about every other country.
Okay, fair enough. You addressed China and supply chains. There were a lot of questions about supply chains from the perspective of, as this thing seems to go on, people are seeing empty shelves and different things,
Yep.
and they're concerned about. So can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
what's the thought in Washington on short-term supply chains? Like long-term, let's not rely on
Yeah.
China, I get that. But
Yeah.
short-term, like toilet paper, the run on the bank, all that kind of stuff. So what's the
It's a good
thinking?
question. I think we're going to see pockets of inflation and shortages, maybe analogous to the early to mid 40s, and as we got into World War II, we had shortages. Right now, there's an inflation run on beef, hamburger, things like that. You see things that are missing from the shelves. I think we're going to have to get used to that. I think food will go up. I saw a piece on TV this morning, people complaining about food, but the flip side is gasoline and a wide range of other products that you're going to see a deflationary move. Uh, Inflation is always tricky. It's always in the eye of the beholder. But I think by and large, inflation will be extremely well contained. I don't see any big inflationary pop in the labor market. I mean, if you talk to central bankers around the world, including central bankers at the Fed, they would tell you the one type of inflation they worry about the most intractable type of inflation is wage inflation. And I don't see anything coming there. I think that's going to be quite dormant for quite some time to come.
Yeah. Okay. Um, there were a number of questions about people. You again referenced it a little. I'm just curious if you have anything to expand on it about the yin and yang of people just, hey, be free or die, let me out. I don't want to, I should be able to go to a restaurant and go to a bar,
Yeah,
and the people, you know, and I guess there were a number of questions, everything from, what happens as this goes on and the social unrest aspects. And, I mean, you've got
yeah,
this, and it literally looks like it's lining up on red and blue states. I mean, it's kind
yeah.
of crazy.
It's a difficult issue. It's I have friends in Lansing, Michigan, and you see in Lansing, Michigan now, people with the Confederate flag and AK-47 rifles, and you go, my God, um, this is extraordinary. This is hard to fathom. So, like everything in this country, this has become very polarized. I read an interesting piece yesterday. I forget who wrote it, about how even people who wear masks are part of a polarization. If you wear a mask, that means you're a left winger or a liberal. If you don't wear a mask, you're a rugged individualist. And I mean, I think that's BS, frankly. I think people have to listen to the science. Unless we want to go through this thing for another round, I think that would be tragic if we ignore the scientists. But at the same time, I mean, I have to have compassion for people uh, who don't make that much money, who are at risk of losing everything, who have to put food on the table. You know, if I were God for a day, I probably would have a very big stimulus package for these people. But at the same time, you know, I think you can't let policy be dictated by guys in uh, with Confederate flags and AK-47s. You can't. Your policy cannot be run by people like that.
Yeah. One of the things that a lot of people are hearing about in the news, and I think we've actually seen this and experienced it ourselves, you know, they have these huge stimulus packages, right? And
Yep.
then it filters down into 1,200 bucks a person,
Yep.
or um, you know, the PPP, and then you read the stories about Sidwell Friends School with a
Yep.
$53 million endowment getting a $5
Yep.
million loan, and you know, these organizations with the lawyers up swoop in, take most of the money, and then all these other companies can't figure out what's the, I mean, talk about creating social unrest.
Yep.
What's the thought in Washington on that, right? I mean, are they not, are they blind to this? Are they understanding that? Are they seeing it?
Two big problems, Greg. The first was that the Small Business Administration had really antiquated computers. Maybe they had hamsters helping to run the computers. I mean, but the computers were so outdated that the Small Business Administration was totally overwhelmed and couldn't get money to people quickly. The second problem is that a lot of greedy pigs cut in line. Restaurant chains, a lot of institutions, I won't name them all, but a lot of institutions that didn't deserve the money, didn't need the money, got in line. My sister owns a small restaurant in New Hampshire. She's got 50 employees. She applied right away and she finally got an answer, yes. And they called her the next day and said, sorry, we ran out of money. She eventually got some in the second tranche. My wife has a small business. She hasn't heard from anybody. And I've got other friends who have been ignored. And I think a lot of people who, I mean, I'm doing fine. My wife's doing fine. But I think there are a lot of people who own a small restaurant or a small, you know, a very small business of three, four, five people who got shut out. And I think many of these people feel this process is not fair. So in the new bill, there will be, as I mentioned earlier, I do think there will be one last stimulus bill. And I think in this last bill, if there's anything for small business, there's going to be really strict oversight, really strict provisions on who actually could qualify for it. And also, there is many Republicans who say the unemployment benefit, $600 a week, is so generous that it actually could be a disincentive for people to search for jobs. I think that's going to have to be addressed as well. So when you throw this amount of money out, you know you're going to have horror stories. You're going to have people who abuse the system, who take advantage of the system. It's very unfortunate, and there are people in Congress who are saying, Mitch McConnell and others who are saying, you know, let's not move immediately on this next bill. Let's wait a couple of months to see how the first 3 trillion worked. Let's see how it looks to see the government, the economy open up. Let's see how that looks before we spend another 3 trillion. And I think part of it is because of all of these scandalous stories about who got aid, who didn't deserve aid.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's pretty frustrating.
Yep.
Personally, I look at that. Um, Here's a question I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. A lot of people equate this like they either say, "Oh, I went through 2008 and 9 financial crisis," and then everyone's saying this isn't that and all that. And I think this question goes to that: is money in big banks safe? Are the big banks okay? Right? I mean,
Yes.
I
Yes.
think that's a
I,
really good question on a lot of people's minds.
if there's one difference between this crisis and the crisis a decade or so ago, decade and a half ago now, it's that the banks are exceptionally well capitalized. I give Powell great credit. The Fed is determined to make the banks very well capitalized. So I do not see a liquidity crisis for the banks. To me, that is maybe the primary distinction, other than the fact that it's a different crisis. This is a virus. The rest was a bubble that popped.
Yeah.
But no, I've talked to people in the banking industry. They're very well capitalized. Could there be, a move to force banks to uh, stop paying dividends? I don't think so. I've heard about it maybe in a couple of European countries, but I don't think it would happen here. But no, I think, and I'm hardly a Pollyanna, but I think the banks are in very good shape.
Okay, great. A few more questions. We have a little bit of time.
Please.
Um, so we haven't touched on this, and we had intended to originally in the concept of this whole event. But I'm personally on the board of the Marine Mammal Center.
Hmm.
Environmental and ocean health is obviously a big issue for us, and something we support highly at Private Ocean. A number of people, both early questions and then some of the people that are putting in questions now, are asking just in general about environmental issues. Is this all just completely getting, obviously you've got a White House that's kind of at war with anything environmental,
Yep.
and then and now you've got this. Just any thoughts on any of that?
Yep.
Anything you're hearing in the hallways? Is it completely, you know, out
Well,
of sight, out of mind?
first of all, Greg, I could make a dozen comments, but let me make two in particular. The first is that as an old runner, and I ran today, I've been shocked at how blue the sky is, how blue the water is. I've seen pictures recently of Venice. I have a painting of Venice behind me. I've seen pictures of the canals in Venice, which used to be polluted and disgusting. They're crystal clear. All of these streams have looked so much healthier. The air is so much healthier because we see a lack of pollution as people aren't driving as much. So if anyone ever wanted any proof of what could happen if we cut way back on these emissions and pollutants, the proof is irrefutable at this point. Second point I'd make is that even with this crisis, the Trump administration almost daily is killing regulations, you name it, regulations on all sorts of emissions, asbestos emissions, any kind of toxic emissions. They're cutting way back. As you know, they've tried to cut back on California auto emissions as well. So the undoing of all of the regulations that have been in place for the last decade or so is astonishing. And I would, if I were advising Joe Biden, I don't advise anybody. I'm not a member of either party. But if I were advising Joe Biden, I think he should go to the American public and tell them that what is being undone in all of these regulations for air, water, you name it, fracking. I think that would be a potent argument for Biden, because even if the Senate stays Republican, Biden would have the ability to make a lot of regulatory changes, as Trump has done. Biden would have wide latitude. And that reminded me, I think we got a few minutes, Greg. I
Yeah,
didn't mention one subject, and I think it's worth spending 1 minute on.
sure.
And that is, uh, I think for investors, the Senate election, in many respects, is almost as important as the presidential election. And I say that because the House will stay liberal, the House will stay Democratic, no question about that. And the House will send over to the Senate some very activist legislation, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, big new tax hikes maybe. But the Senate will be the firewall. And the Senate has been the firewall for the last couple of years, with Mitch McConnell running things, getting all of his judges confirmed, killing all the legislation that comes over from the House. So I think investors need to look at this. The Senate right now is 53-47 Republican. I've looked at the races. The Democrats are going to lose one seat for sure. That's in Alabama. So they need a net pickup of 4 or 5 if Trump is reelected. The Democrats are close. I think they could get 3 or 4. 5 if Trump is reelected might be a stretch. But there are several races, not going to go through all of them, but Susan Collins in Maine, there's a Colorado seat. There are a couple of others that look pretty shaky for the Republicans right now. So that's another one to watch. So it's not going to be the presidential race. I think we all have to watch the Senate race, because that will determine the fate of all of this legislation that will come out of the House.
Okay, sounds good. The last question, and this is actually something that I thought about when I was listening to you. We are inundated, all of us, you, me, and everybody, we're inundated with information. I find that people tend to sort of rely pretty heavily on, one source or a couple sources. What's your take, or what's your recommendation, or can you just, are there 2 or 3
Yeah.
sources of
Yep.
data and information that somehow don't completely bias or are so conflicted that all they're doing is validating whatever worldview? And the reason I ask is because one of the things I'm fond of
Hmm.
saying is lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yep.
So even the data on this
Right.
disease, I've got friends in this ear going, you know, we're not doing enough and we should all stay
Hmm.
home forever, whatever. And then I got friends in this here going, this is all a socialist takeover, and
Yep.
and then I've got friends in the middle.
Yep.
So what's your thought? What are good sources? Because I watch a lot of different ones, and I'm always
Yep.
stunned at how incredibly disingenuous most of them are. They have
Yep.
their they have their news and data. They leave out whole chunks of other parts of the
Hmm.
story, and then they
Hmm.
just go and pound away. And I think it's hurtful, right? I mean, it's really hard it's all part of the polarization, right, of America.
It's a great question. I get the question from time to time. And since my first profession, 100 years ago, I was a journalist. I have a lot of friends who are reporters. And I'd say that, first of all, I read everything I can get my hands on early. I write every day. As you know, I send you my piece. And so I read everything I can get my hands on. And I would say for the best reporting on what's going on Capitol Hill, what's going on with legislation, what's going on with the economy, is the Wall Street Journal. Now, their editorial page is a different story. It's very far to the right, as you know. But I think their reporting is first rate. I have friends who are reporters there, and they're very objective. The reporters don't have an ideological axe to grind. The New York Times is quite far to the left. The Washington Post is far to the left. L.A. Times, San Francisco Chronicle. But I know that, and I filter out their bias, and I look for what they write about. And sometimes they write good pieces, but you have to filter out a bias that they have. The Financial Times of London does a pretty good job too. I think they're fairly unbiased, maybe a little to the left. But then you go to television. Oh my God, it's hard to find any network that doesn't have a bias. I mean, you've got obviously Fox, which has a bias. You've got CNN, MSNBC, others that clearly have a bias on the left. And I've been doing this for so long that I can look at them and say, well, that's liberal BS or that's conservative BS, and I can filter it out. Unfortunately, there are many people who are watching who can't filter it out, who don't realize the bias. And I do think it's an unfortunate trend in the country that, I mean, facts are facts. I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the great politicians in the history of my career, once said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but you are not entitled to your own facts." And I think that the press owes it to us to at least get the facts right. I'll provide the opinion in my own head, but if I had a half an hour and I had to get real smart, real quick on what's going on with the economy in Capitol Hill, I'd read the Wall Street Journal news section.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks. Well, listen, on behalf of Private Ocean, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you to our clients and attendees that came and watched this. And thank you again. If you want more information, Greg, I think you have a blog and a website and things like that. I do get your daily updates, and I find them very interesting. And of course, Private Ocean, we're at privateocean.com. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you for your time, Greg.
And I wish you all good health.
Thank you.